Welcome to Calf Academy, your source for calf care education.
The topic for this section is going to be automatic calf feeders. An overview of this slide set will start with the advantage of auto feeders. We'll talk about some of the different auto feeder options. We'll do a brief look at facility design. We'll talk about how auto feeders work, calf management recommendations, and then feeding programs. A key question to be asking anybody that is interested in using automatic calf feeders is this going to be the right thing for your operation? Because oftentimes people don't have the right expectation of what they're getting themselves into before they get in and spend the kind of money on not only a building, but the machines themselves. So what are some of the advantages of using automatic calf feeders? Well, I think, the number one thing is that we can set up a feeding plan to be able to meet very specific performance objectives for your operation. Secondly, we can monitor feeding behavior, how fast they're drinking, how often they drink, how much they drink. All of those sorts of things are fairly easy to monitor. Another feature is calves can eat pretty much all that they want. So they feel satisfied, they feel full, they're less likely to engage in other types of poor behavior like cross-sucking or something like that. The ability for calves to eat small amounts frequently is a very key feature of an automatic calf feeder. It more makes it seem like typically what they do if they were still nursing off the cow. So they can get optimal use of their nutrients and better able to implement the intensive growth feeding programs that are so common today. And finally, it may or may not be about labor efficiency. In some cases, you spend less time mixing milk, less time working directly with the equipment, but you spend a lot more time observing calves in a group setting. So it may be more about a trade-off in labor rather than labor efficiency itself. There are several options for automatic calf feeders. In this slide, there's 3 options that you'll see around the United States. The Urban, the Holman Lau are both units that are made in Germany, and the Biotic is a lower cost automatic calf feeder that is manufactured in Tennessee. However, there's one company, Forester Technique, that makes several brands for different companies, but they're all typically the same machine. So Forester will make a machine for De Laval, for Gia, or Lely. All these machines are fairly close to the same and operate similarly. So what do these machines cost? Well, the Tennessee unit, fairly simple to use, low maintenance. That machine can be purchased for around $2,500. And buying some of the more expensive units that come from Germany, it can be up to $25,000. Some of these machines can feed up to 25 calves per nipple. At least that's what the claim is made. Oftentimes that number of calves per nipple is not really very practical. Some of these machines will have an extensive software package to help track what's happening with the calf and how they're consuming feed and what their feeding behavior is. These calves can nurse up to 4 to 12 times per day on these automatic calf feeders. And often with the more expensive units, it will have a setup where they can be scheduled to clean themselves several times throughout the day. Although they aren't really called automatic calf feeders, some inexpensive alternatives can exist by utilizing multiple nipples in one barrel, like with a milk bar, or we can have calves nursing out of a barrel with tubes, a nipple and a tube, and one-way valves within the tube, so all the calves can drink at once and essentially drink anytime they want during the day. In this situation, there's really no monitoring of how much each calf consumes, but oftentimes these are the sorts of setups that you see with acidified milk. So the building becomes a very important piece when an overall plan is put together for automatic calf feeders. The type of facility typically has the ability to have a warm room with water for the machine to be housed in, and then various configurations of calf pens will be something that the farm has to decide on. Just as each machine is unique, the type of feeding station that exists for each machine can be slightly different. Lely and Gia and De Laval with the Forester types of machines will have the same basic option as far as the feeding station goes. You'll see some differences with the Holman Lau and Urban types of units. In this slide, you can see an example of a Lely automatic calf feeder and how the calves are directed into a stall so they can nurse without being disturbed by the calves behind them. This is just one example to be able to show you what they may look like. This is a picture of some calves that are lining up to get inside the feeding stalls for an urban type of feeder. This slide is simply showing the calf in the stall nursing. The calf has got a neck collar on that will hold the transponder that alerts the machine identification of the calf that's coming into the machine. There are some general specifications that we have to think about when we put calves into a group housing. We typically think of calves needing 30 to 35 square feet of bedded space per calf, and oftentimes this will translate into 40 square feet of total space per calf for each pen. Buildings that are wide oftentimes require some positive pressure ventilation, as shown in the picture on the right side of this slide. Sometimes buildings that are narrower than 30 feet can get by with natural ventilation. In group pens, bedding has to be very clean, so the calves can nest in it, they can stay dry, and the bedding has to be clean enough so they aren't exposed to one another's diarrhea manure in the event that there's a scours case within the pen. Typically, the buildings will have 8 to 10 foot sidewalls, sometimes as much as 12 foot sidewalls. Oftentimes, these buildings will have a opening along the ridge that is usually about 2 inches per 10 feet of width. And this opening in the ridge likely should have a cover so snow or rain doesn't come into the stalls. Curtains work very well. These types of buildings have to be set up for good, clean air, so they must ventilate properly. This is an example of a very common rectangular type of building with the center with the feeding room in the center. So there could be, for example, 1 feeder or 2 feeders in this feeder room distributing milk to calves in each one of the different pens. Typically, this type of barn will be set up for calves that need about 100 head, something like that, available for feeding milk. This building is 50 feet wide, so most certainly would need to use some positive pressure tubes. And as you could imagine, this type of building could be made that the building could be long and narrow rather than the rectangular shape, and it would have the same footprint, and that would allow better ventilation within this type of barn. This slide shows a group of calves within a pen. In the background, you can see the water and the feeder opening for the nipple. Things to notice on this slide are the high sidewalls to the left and the space, at least what's visible within this picture. It looks like the calves are relatively crowded. However, the straw looks clean and fluffy. So there would need to be more assessment for the calves for this type of facility, but because of the high wall along the left side, it certainly would be most likely that there would have to be a positive pressure ventilation system in this building. This is an example of a smaller barn with 1 feeder that can have 2 nipples and 30 feet wide, so it would likely have very good cross ventilation within the barn. This is an example of a ventilated barn that has more of a tunnel type of a system. You can see the fans in the far end of this barn. There's 2 pens serviced by 1 urban auto feeder with 2 nipples. As you can see, the straw or shavings or sawdust that's on the floor in here looks like it's fairly clean. However, there doesn't appear to be very much opportunity for calves to nestle down within that bedding. Oftentimes, when people are investing in auto feeders, they'll want to think about a new barn at the same time, but it's also very common to take an existing facility and set it up so the calves will have the right kind of total space per calf, good ventilation, and older converted barns can work very, very well. This shows the before and after of a barn that was converted into a calf facility that had a very low roof, and this facility is an example of something that works very well. It has a tunnel type of ventilation system, but it's set up in a way that the air is tempered that comes into this building, and it's pulled across both pens to do a fairly good job of clean air and good ventilation. So most of the machines have at least some method of collecting data on the calf performance or the calf behavior in their drinking patterns. So they certainly have the ability to program what you want the calves to eat and, of course, collect the information on what the calf is actually doing. These are two examples, the one on the left using the handheld device with the Forester type of machine, and this is the information panel that's on an urban unit. These auto feeders oftentimes will have an ability to add a small amount of different types of medications or electrolytes. In this slide, there's pointed out that the medicator that's attached to this Forester machine is useful to be able to add small amounts of these additives, like an antibiotic or some other type of medication. So with any piece of equipment, maintenance becomes a key feature and a critical part of management of the automatic calf feeder. The key part of maintenance on an auto feeder is being able to keep the machine clean. All of the components of the machine that are in contact with either the milk powder or the liquid milk needs to be monitored and cleaned on a daily basis. Milk residue is an excellent growth media for bacteria, and as this milk residue can build up, and it can actually cause the machine not to function properly. As mentioned, most of these feeders have automatic wash cycles that they can be set to wash on a regular basis, but very often they do require that they have a manual process at least daily as well. Each one of these auto feeders have different specific ways to accomplish that, and it is very important that you follow the specific recommendations from the company, for each individual machine. As with any piece of equipment, following a checklist is always a good idea to make sure the same things are done correctly every single time. And again, following the manufacturer's recommendations. These machines need to be calibrated, so that's part of the maintenance, to make sure that the correct amount of milk powder or water, detergents, or any kind of medications that are dispensed, that they're dispensing the correct amount. This type of calibration should be done anytime you're changing milk replacers, because they'll all have a different kind of density that you have to take into account. Some machines will have very sophisticated automatic calibration where there's a load cell underneath the mixer that will help determine if the machine is dispensing the proper amounts. And here again, follow manufacturer recommendations. Another very important piece of maintenance is making sure that the nipples are clean and that they're replaced every day, so you're not allowing the biofilm to build up within these nipples. As already mentioned, the milk contact surfaces have to be cleaned correctly, and also by using the right detergent in the right amount. So many times the equipment company will have recommendations of the type of detergents that should be used. Oftentimes these machines have a fairly low temperature on their boilers, so you need a low temperature type of detergent that has a high level of surfactants within the detergent. So follow the directions for the use of these detergents, because they've got very specific types of instructions on how they're used. Another key piece to monitor is the chute through which the powder is dispensed into the mixer. This outlet from the hopper will have a tendency to plug up slightly. You should make sure that you monitor that daily to make sure that the flow of powder is not restricted coming out of the hopper. Oftentimes, there's a small tool that is attached near the mixer to help with this cleaning. The hoses that transport the milk from the mixer to the nipple should also be closely monitored. Those hoses are sometimes fairly long. They can be hard to clean. Oftentimes it's impossible to get any kind of turbulence within these hoses to help with the cleaning process. So oftentimes these hoses, instead of struggling with trying to clean them, oftentimes they could be replaced on a regular basis in addition to, the regular cleaning. Nipples, as already mentioned, should be removed and cleaned daily. They should be replaced when they show signs of wear or cracking. It's very important to use a good brush when you're cleaning inside of the nipple. Use very hot water to clean effectively. We want to do everything we can do to minimize biofilm growth within these nipples. Allow them to dry, sanitize them before you use them. And another good tip is to rotate the nipple a quarter of a turn each day. This will help these nipples last longer. They won't flatten out as the calves nurse on them. There are very specific instructions on how each machine cleans, and you really have to understand the steps that are involved. Sometimes it's automatic, other times they have a manual step, especially in the Forester type of machines, that they have a circuit cleaning. And this cleaning step is very important. It's sometimes overlooked by owners of the machine. It can't be emphasized enough that cleaning is one of the most critical steps for the successful use of the auto feeder. Deciding how you're going to start your calves on the auto feeder is a big decision. And oftentimes it depends, most importantly, on the size of the herd, how fast the auto feeder will fill. What's the age spread that will be between the youngest calf and the oldest calf within a pen? Some farms are able to start calves as soon as 3 days of age, while other farms wait till they're almost 2 weeks of age. And there again, this sometimes depends on how fast the pens can be filled, depending on how fast the calves are born. And of course, that depends on how big a farm. The biggest challenge that exists is having very young calves competing with older calves within the same pen, from a disease standpoint, from a competition standpoint, and the success of the group-fed calves sometimes hinges on this age spread. There's different types of calf raising operations. Ones where calves come out directly out of the dairy on site. There's good management in the calving pens. The calves have a very low death loss, low clinical disease. This is considered a high health type of herd. These sorts of herds, the calves can go on the auto feeder very quickly because these calves do not have high risk for disease, as opposed to calves that are all sourced from various places like through a sales barn. These calves are more likely to have diarrhea, more likely to be stressed, more likely to have poor colostrum status. It's likely a good idea to feed these calves individually for 10 to 14 days prior to putting them into the group. Oftentimes it'll get them past that point of high risk and more successfully transfer onto the group situation more successfully. Since many of these feeders were developed in Germany, the measurements and the manuals and the settings are typically in metric units. Being able to be comfortable converting these units between English and metric can be very, very helpful. Some helpful conversions are 1 pound equals 454 grams. 1 gallon is approximately 3.8 liters. 1 liter is equal to 1,000 milliliters, which also is equal to 1,000 grams for water and 1,030 grams for milk. Those are some very important numbers that you should commit to memory. So as you decide if you're going to buy a automatic calf feeder or not, you should consider certain things. You should look at what your goals are for your calves. You should think about what kind of powder concentration that you're going to have for the calves every day, because you want it to be the same all the time. You want to think about how much volume you're going to feed, how many liters per day. The schedule looks like how often you're going to allow your calves to eat, and then what kind of milk replacer or what kind of milk are you going to be able to feed the calves. So when we talk about calf growth goals, typically we think about higher feeding rates is going to require more management. We have to think about calves that drink more milk may be more difficult to wean. So we have to think about timing of the weaning and then of course the cost of the extra milk that we're going to feed these calves. So putting all of these growth goals together, tying it back to your budget becomes a very important part to think about before even going out and purchasing a feeder. In this slide, we state the obvious. The more we feed calves, the better they're going to gain. And of course, that's assuming that energy or protein is not limiting in their feed. So you need to work with a nutritionist to be able to determine the correct protein and the correct energy to have in the milk for these calves. So with these milk replacer feeding programs, a conventional type of feeding program is 20 to 22% protein, 18 to 20% fat, and typically fed at 1 to 1.5 pounds of dry matter per calf per day. This is a small amount of milk replacer, but it's going to allow calves to maximize their starter intake. On the other hand, we can go more of a moderate type of program that we raise the crude protein somewhat, leave the fat around the same, but feed anywhere from 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds of milk solids per calf per day. This is kind of a moderate program, moderate starter intake. Calves do very well in this situation. And then there's the intensive type of program where you feed lots of dry matter, 2 to 3 pounds per calf per day. In those situations, you have to have more protein, and fat still typically stays in that 16 to 20% range. The challenge in this type of program is getting calves to wean onto dry feed. So extra effort is to be put towards a weaning strategy to make sure that the calves do well after they're weaned off from milk. Automatic calf feeders are, by just their design, they're made for high intake. For those farms want to get as high of milk intake as possible, allowing for higher levels of growth. So this intensive approach fits very, very well with the automatic calf feeder. So the types of powder that would go in those, higher protein, more moderate fat, like in this example, the 2518 would work very well, and actually very much better performance coming out of that than a typical 2020. In any case, in any kind of a program, we still always have to remember that having good, clean, fresh water is important. So when we have calves that are well satisfied in the amount of feed that they've drank, that they feel full and satiated, they got good, clean surroundings, they're much less likely to become engaged in destructive behavior like cross-sucking or nail or tail biting, those sorts of things. So one of the goals that is talked about frequently is to be able to look at these different types of feeding programs and try and experience and a benefit from this higher feeding, better growth as a calf, and what impact it will have on milk production in their first lactation. So this was a study that was done at the University of Minnesota in Waukesha, where they compared conventionally fed calves to the moderately fed calves to the intensive fed calves. And the statistical difference that showed up here was that the intensively fed calves had an age in calving that was statistically lower than the calves fed in either on the conventional or the modified. There was a numerical difference in the amount of milk that was produced in that first lactation, but again, it was not significant statistically. So the powder concentration goals for these feeders can really be very simple. It's very, very common to just set the feeder at 13% solids, which calculates out to about 150 grams on top of a liter of water. So work with your individual feeder settings to be able to get that type of program together, and it'll be very successful. And that will allow a powder intake of roughly in that 2 to 3 pounds per calf per day. I think it's important for people to understand how the percent solids is calculated. So you always take the grams of powder, or the weight of the powder, and divide it by the weight of the water plus the grams of the powder, or the weight of the powder. So in this example, if we're putting 150 grams of powder on top of 1 liter of water, which weighs 1,000 grams, plus the 150 grams of powder, that's 150 divided by 1150, and that equals 0.13 or 13% solids. This type of calculation is done the same way, using the same units for weight of powder and weight of water. With an automatic calf feeder, the volume to feed is probably one of the biggest flexibilities there are, feeding anywhere from 6 to 12 liters of solution or per day. And you can typically see 4 to 8 feedings per day is a very, very common type of program you can set up from a volume standpoint. So when you're setting up your feeding schedule, think about things like how long do you want to feed them, how many feedings per day, and how much do you want them to drink or consume at each meal. So the way you can design your feeding plan. You can start a calf out slower, ramp them up to a high level, and then ramp them down to a weaning level over a 10 to 14 days. There's a lot of flexibility in these machines to design a program like that can be very successful. So meal size can be adjusted within these machines as well. So just like the calf that's on the cow, they can have smaller, more frequent meals, which helps for better digestibility of the milk, and behavioral becomes more normal type of behavior. So setting up the meal limitations for younger calves, it can typically be 1 to 1.5 liters per feeding. So then they can eat several times a day. Older calves, they can eat 2 to 2.5 liters per feeding. They can easily handle that kind of volume. And within these meal sizes and feeding programs, what we're ultimately trying to get to is a good, healthy growth, and with the final objective of getting great starter intake at the end of the feeding program. So choosing the right kind of milk replacer is important. We already talked about the level of protein and fat. We need to have a milk replacer that flows well through the discharge chute, one that mixes well and stays in solution. And as we'd already talked about, those higher feeding rates require higher protein. And finally, most units will have the ability to feed whole milk or milk replacer or a combination. So think through as you decide what kind of feeder you're going to get, that you can have that flexibility in the future if you should want to feed whole milk. So when we talk of milk replacers, we can have the instant type of milk replacers that mix very well and they stay in solution well. This mixability feature is not quite as important because the mixer within these machines is typically very aggressive, and the milk mixes rapidly and completely with many different kinds of powder. It's more about making sure that the powder has the ability to flow out of the hopper than the ability to get the milk mixed. So looking at milk replacers that can be what's commonly called a dry blend or an agglomerated all seem to work very well in these machines. The milk replacer is consistent, not only from bag to bag, but from batch to batch. And again, it has to feed through the machine without bridging or catching up or building up residue. And, mixing temperature becomes fairly important as well. Some milk replacers have directions where they have to mix at 150 degrees. These types of milk replacers should not be used, however. Look for those type of milk replacers that will mix anywhere from 110 to 120 degrees, even down as low as 105. However, some milk replacers will actually cool the mix after they mix at a higher temperature. They'll add some cold water to it so they feed at the correct temperature. So the protein source in a milk replacer is something to think about. You can either use an all milk or all milk with plasma. Those two types of protein sources are ideal. They work very, very well in group housing situations. They work very, very well when you have high feeding rates. The crude protein levels should be at least 24% in order to promote this frame growth at these high feeding rates. There are many, many additives that can be added to milk replacers. Things like moss or direct-fed microbials or essential oils. All of these types of products are known to be a good technology. There's many types of options that are available, and you should consult with a qualified nutritionist to decide which of these would be beneficial for your specific operation. As already mentioned, there's a medicator on these pieces of equipment, these auto feeders, that can add dry or liquid supplements. These feeders are typically a fairly expensive option to add on, and however, they can be very useful for feeding things like medications or electrolytes, every feeding or at specific feedings within the feeding plan. In summary, there's lots of good machines out there. Facility design can be very, very important to make sure that the calves have the right kind of space, the right kind of air, good bedding, good drainage. The calves are clean, dry, and comfortable. Decide if auto feeder is right for your operation. Determine what you want for growth goals and put a feeding program that's going to work based on those goals. If you're feeding more milk, you just have to realize that you're going to have to allow more time to wean, and that becomes a real key piece to the success of a program. And when you feed more milk, it's going to cost more. So you have to decide if those types of objectives are ones that fit within your overall calf raising enterprise. Remember, if you're going to be feeding more milk, high levels of solids, you have to feed more protein, because protein becomes really important when we're looking at structural growth. We don't want to limit the calf's ability to achieving the structural growth with these types of feeding systems.
Thank you for completing this Calf Academy course. If you have follow-up questions, please contact your Milk Products National Account Manager